Herbert Spencer was an English philosopher and prominent right-wing political theorist from the 19th century. Spencer is best known for the expression survival of the fittest, which he coined in his 1864 book Principles of Biology, after reading Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Though Spencer made some valuable contributions to early sociology, his attempt to introduce Darwinian ideas into the realm of sociology was unsuccessful. By the turn of the 20th century, Spencer's theories of laissez-faire and survival of the fittest had an enduring and even increasing appeal in the social science fields of economics and political science. Spencer has been regarded as a precursor by right libertarians and anarcho-capitalists such as economist Murray Rothbard, who called Spencer's book Social Statistics the greatest single work of libertarian political philosophy ever written. Spencer denounced Irish land reform, compulsory education, laws to regulate safety at work, tax-funded libraries, and welfare reforms. Spencer's misattribution of the theory of evolution to social policy would have dire effects on history. It was considered by many to be actively dangerous and is integrally related to the 19th century rise in scientific racism. Such ideas also helped to advance euthanasia in Nazi Germany, especially Action T4, which led to the murder of mentally ill and disabled people. Social Darwinist and laissez-faire ideas can be found throughout Hitler's speeches and writings. Our great heads of industry are not concerned with the accumulation of wealth and the good life. Rather, they are concerned with responsibility and power. They have acquired this right by natural selection. They are members of the higher race. The head of the enterprise is dependent on his workforce. The willingness of his workers to participate in the common effort. If they strike, his property is worthless. I absolutely insist on protecting private property. We must encourage private initiative.
Hitler was obsessed with the idea of the survival of the fittest, and Goebbels' propaganda films reflected this obsession. Hitler believed human beings were simply animals, and that the strongest animal would always win. If his subordinates were strong enough, then they would succeed without his help.
Man diese schönen, starken Tiere zum Kampf auf Leben und Tod. Und in ihrem Walde hätten beide so ruhig weiterleben können.
Aber liebes Fräulein Volkmann, ein ruhiges Leben ist doch nirgends in der Natur zu finden.
Aber Herr Professor, es fressen sich doch nicht alle gegenseitig auf.
Wenn auch das nicht gerade, aber sie leben alle in einem ständigen Kampf. Dabei wird das Schwache vernichtet.
Just as it was with animals, so it was with great men, and even whole countries. Hitler believed the entire world was locked in a permanent struggle in which the stronger must prevail. This was the theory he developed in Mein Kampf, the book he had written in 1924.
If you have private ownership of the means of production, internally, it's essentially a totalitarian institution, almost necessarily. There's a group at the top, maybe a person or a group, they make the decisions, they give orders, people down the hierarchy get the orders, transmit them. At the very bottom, you get people who are permitted to rent themselves to survive. That's called a job, wage labor. And you get the outside community who's allowed to purchase what you produce, and of course they're very heavily propagandized to make them want to consume it even if they don't. So I mean, that's the nature of the system. It's kind of about as close to totalitarianism as you can imagine.
Austria, 1932. Engelbert Dollfuss of the Christian Social Party is designated Chancellor of Austria. He creates a new radical political movement called the Fatherland Front, in the image of Italian fascism. The Fatherland Front seek to protect Austria's Catholic traditions from Protestant-dominated Germany. While in power, the Fatherland Front establishes an authoritarian and corporatist regime, the Federal State of Austria. The Front banned and persecuted all of its political opponents, including communists, social democrats, but also the Austrian Nazis who want Austria to join Germany.
Civil war flares up suddenly in Austria. The government, deciding to suppress the socialists, countered a general strike by martial law. These pictures, rushed to Britain from Vienna, show vividly the state of desperate crisis through which Austria has been passing. The strongholds in which the Schutzbund, or Socialist Defense League, hold out are huge blocks of flats built for the Viennese workers by the Socialist Council of the city. Here, the socialists and communists, suspicious of the dictatorship of Dr. Dollfuss, have secreted guns and ammunition for the coup d'etat which they feared.
Leftists who opposed Dollfuss were accused of opposing individual liberty, as Dollfuss was eradicating democratic institutions, freedom of the press, and dismantling the constitutional courts. Serving as chief economic advisor to Dollfuss was a man in favor of radical capitalist policies named Ludwig von Mises, who helped shape Austrian economic policy. In his early life, Mises attended the University of Vienna, where he was highly influenced by Karl Menger, who later founded the Austrian School of Economics, a pro-capitalist think tank which rejects the scientific method in determining its economic theories. In his 1927 book, Liberalism, Ludwig von Mises wrote positively about Benito Mussolini and Italian fascism. It cannot be denied that fascism and similar movements aiming at the establishment of dictatorships are full of the best intentions, and that their intervention has, for the moment, saved European civilization. The merit that fascism has thereby won for itself will live on eternally in history. In 1940, Mises and his wife emigrated to New York City. He came to the United States under grant by the Rockefeller Foundation, which wanted to help Mises spread his free market philosophy. Mises influenced generations of free market activists, including Murray Rothbard, Ron Paul, Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, and even former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, who together have shaped right-libertarianism. In tackling the economic crisis, the Dollfuss dictatorship with the counsel of Ludwig von Mises pursued harsh deflationary policies designed to balance the budget and stabilize the currency. The government's program featured severe spending cuts, frozen wages, and high interest rates. When in 1937 and 38 there was a modest recovery to the global depression, unemployment never dropped below 20%. This had a devastating effect on the legitimacy of the Austrian system. The economic failures of the 1930s should be seen as a substantial reason why the Austrian society was receptive to the annexation by Germany in March 1938.
The majority of Austrians welcomed the Germans into their country. Now united with Germany, they were a power once again.
Deutsche Männer und Frauen, ich proklamiere die älteste Ostmark des deutschen Volkes, weil von jetzt an das jüngste Bollwerk der deutschen Nation und damit des deutschen Reiches.
While Ludwig von Mises was serving under corporatist dictator Engelbert Dollfuss, the pendulum was swinging the opposite direction in the United States. The American people were untrustworthy of conservatives after the Great Depression was initiated under Republican Herbert Hoover. Hoover sought to avoid direct federal intervention to remedy the Depression, believing that the best way to bolster the economy was through the strengthening of businesses, such as banks and railroads. Hoover also refused to implement a welfare state to take care of those living in poverty, due to no fault of their own. The American people were ready to embrace a social democrat who promised to challenge corporate greed.
We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace: business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering. They had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. And we know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob.
Roosevelt gets sweeping bank regulations, social welfare programs, and infrastructure projects passed. The president quickly becomes regarded as a traitor to his class. A new organization emerges called the American Liberty League. The Liberty League in its founding document describes itself as a nonpartisan organization founded to defend the Constitution and defend the rights and liberties guaranteed by that Constitution. General Smedley Butler, a distinguished war veteran, is approached by the Liberty League. They try to convince Butler to lead a private army of 500,000 veterans to overthrow FDR, using Hitler's stormtroopers and Mussolini's black shirts as a model for success. Members of the Liberty League included representatives of America's top corporations, including J.P. Morgan, DuPont, and Goodyear Tire. Prescott Bush, grandfather of George W. Bush, was also involved with the Liberty League. Their objective, as outlined to Butler, was to install a pro-business dictator who would reinstate the gold standard and repeal the New Deal. This fascist plot comes to the knowledge of New York Democrat Samuel Dickstein, who successfully gets approval for an investigative committee. The trail leads them to General Smedley Butler.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions.
The investigative committee ultimately finds evidence of a plot, but does not call for the testimony of the conspirators, and the investigation dies.
Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
The business elite soon realized a coup was no longer necessary if they could somehow divide the working class opposition, crippling the parliamentary process. After the end of World War II, large sects of the economic and political elite successfully shift focus to an all-powerful big government. In other words, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
What has been created by this half century of massive corporate propaganda is what's called anti-politics. So anything that goes wrong, you blame the government. Well, okay, there's plenty to blame the government about. But the government is the one institution in which that people can change. It's the one institution you can affect by participation without institutional change, right? That's exactly why all the anger and fear is directed against the government. The government has a defect. It's potentially democratic. Corporations have no defect. They're pure tyrannies. So therefore you want to keep corporations invisible and focus all anger on the government.
In 1946, what is generally regarded as the first pro-business libertarian think tank emerges in the United States, called the Foundation for Economic Education. FEE sought to sell free market capitalism as an entirely new product to those who lost faith in the capitalist system after the Great Depression. It was founded by an American economist influenced by the Austrian School of Economics named Henry Hazlitt, Leonard Reed from the Chamber of Commerce, and David Goodrich of the Goodrich Corporation. John Birch Society founder Robert Welch also sat on its board of trustees. FEE was an early promoter of both Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard, who have emphasized their contempt for democracy in their writings, favoring a meritocratic survival of the financially fittest style social order. Within its first 4 years, FEE was funded by executives from corporate giants like Standard Oil, Monsanto, General Electric, DuPont, Ford, Merrill Lynch, and many more. Sitting on the board of FEE was J. Reuben Clark, a devoted anti-Semite who owned multiple copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fabricated text purporting to describe a Jewish plan for global domination. FEE ally Henry Ford funded printing of 500,000 copies of the Protocols that were distributed throughout the United States in the 1920s. FEE also published works by Holocaust deniers and Christian Reconstructionists R.J. Rushdoomy and his son Gary North.
What happens to the economy? Would it return to the gold standard?
Yes, it would.
Because?
Because God stipulates money by measure. Just weights and just measures shall ye have.
Homosexuality?
Yes, it was treason to the family.
Worthy of the death sentence?
What?
Worthy of the death sentence. Deserving of the death sentence.
Yes, that's what Paul says. This is what God requires. This is what God says is justice. Therefore, I don't feel I have a choice.
R.J. Rushdoomy's son, Gary North, is the Director of Development for the Ron Paul Curriculum, a series of homeschooling videos that teach Austrian economic theories and historical revisionism. One of the first men to describe themselves as a libertarian in the United States was journalist H.L. Mencken, a white supremacist and anti-Semite who was part of the original America First movement, opposing the United States entering World War II. Mencken believed Darwin's theories of survival of the fittest should apply to society, and that the superior man should rule over what he saw as the inferior masses. This made him hostile towards all forms of democracy. Ayn Rand addressed Mencken in correspondence as the greatest representative of a philosophy to which she wanted to dedicate her life, individualism, and later described him as her favorite columnist.
The newest proposals of having special millions spent on subnormal children is the attempt to bring everybody to the level of the handicapped.
In 1928, Ayn Rand quoted the statement, "What is good for me is right." This is a quote Rand grabbed from a newspaper article about child killer and psychopath William Edward Hickman. "He is the best and strongest expression of a real man's psychology I have heard," Rand wrote. Rand was planning a novel called The Little Street to feature a Hickman-like character who she considers her ideal man. In her journals, Rand writes that Hickman is born with a wonderful free, light consciousness, the absolute lack of social instinct or herd feeling. He does not understand because he has no organ for understanding the necessity, meaning, or importance of other people. Other people do not exist for him, and he does not understand why they should. Rand also brazenly defended the Native American genocide perpetrated by colonialists.
I do not think that they had any right to live in a country merely because they were born here and acted and lived like savages. And since the Indians did not have any property rights, they didn't have the concept of property. If so, they didn't have any rights to the land, and there was no reason for anyone to grant them rights which they had not conceived and were not using. I would go further. Let's suppose they were all beautifully innocent savages, which they certainly were not. What was it that they were fighting for? If they opposed white men on this continent, for their wish to continue a primitive existence. Any white person who brings the element of civilization have the right to take over this country. I am incidentally in favor of Israel against the Arabs for the very same reason.
It's very hard to remember now what the attitude was in 1944 or 45. And throughout the Western world, the movement was towards centralization, planning, government control. There was those of us who didn't agree, who believed in what we would call a liberal society, a free society.
Friedman and Harberger argued that free market economics went hand in hand with freedom and democracy. But in Chile, where their ideas were being implemented within the context of a military dictatorship, the opposite was true. Many in Latin America saw a direct connection between the economic shocks that impoverished millions of people and the epidemic of torture inflicted on those who believed in a different kind of society. In the 50s and 60s, Chile's progressive developmental policies were a beacon in the region. The government invested in health, education and industry. American corporations were worried their investments would suffer. In response, the US State Department began sponsoring students from Chile and the rest of South America to study free market economics with Milton Friedman.
The University of Chicago had a joint arrangement with the Catholic University of Chile, under which a great many Chilean students came to the University of Chicago, were trained by us and received PhDs.
These students went back and taught in Chile. The Catholic University Economics Department in Santiago became a little Chicago school. Arnold Harberger, the economist in charge of the program, described himself as a seriously dedicated missionary. In 1970, Salvador Allende's Popular Unity government won the election on a platform of nationalization of large sectors of the economy. Chile's phone company was majority owned by the US corporation ITT. It spearheaded attempts to stop Allende becoming president. It had the support of Richard Nixon in the White House.
I was not there, but I can tell you what we now know to be a fact. He ordered the CIA to prevent Allende from assuming the presidency. And indeed, they tried to get me to lean on the Chilean military right after Allende was elected.
Despite the efforts of the CIA, Allende was sworn in as president. Richard Nixon ordered the CIA director to make the economy scream.
Señor Nixon es presidente de Estados Unidos y yo soy presidente de Chile. Yo no tendré un término despectivo contra el señor Nixon mientras el señor Nixon respete al presidente de Chile.
Preparations began for the military coup. The Chilean Chicago boys started work on a 500-page economic blueprint called the BRIC. With US funding, everything was done to destabilize the economy. Truck drivers went on strike, bringing factories and shops to a standstill. There was a failed coup attempt on June the 29th, 1973. And then on September the 11th, with General Pinochet leading the army, the assault began on the presidential palace. Chile had enjoyed 41 years of uninterrupted, peaceful democratic rule. Now it was being violently overthrown. Pinochet and his supporters described the coup as a war. It was certainly designed to look like one. It was a Chilean precursor to shock and awe.
Fuerzas Armadas y de Orden, solo bajo la inspiración patriótica de sacar al país del caos que en forma aguda lo estaba precipitando el gobierno marxista de Salvador Allende.
The Chicago boys delivered their economic blueprint, the BRIC, to Pinochet. In the days that followed, more than 13,000 opponents were arrested and imprisoned. Thousands of prisoners were held in the National Stadium. Many were tortured. Chile became notorious around the world.
¿Cuántas personas?
At the beginning of November, 5,000 prisoners were released. The 900 they left behind were transferred to other detention centres. With the population in shock, Pinochet imposed the policies recommended by the Chicago Boys. Removal of price controls, the sale of state companies, the removal of import barriers and cuts to government expenditure. Friedman later openly acknowledged the importance of the Chilean experiment.
Here was the first case in which you had a movement toward communism, which was replaced by a movement toward free markets.
It didn't work. A year later, inflation was 375% per year, the highest in the world. So in March 1975, Arnold Harberger and Milton Friedman flew into Santiago.
He used a phrase that had never before been used in a real-world economic crisis. He called for shock treatment. He said that he was like a doctor that was going to help a country that was suffering an epidemic, and he was simply prescribing the medicine.
It rapidly became clear that Friedman's economic policies benefited the wealthy at the expense of the poor. It was calculated that a family trying to live on the average wage had to spend 74% of its income on bread. Items such as bus fares or milk became luxuries, and Pinochet got rid of free milk in school, a move that echoed the controversial policy of the young education minister in Britain, who would later become his friend. In order to enforce these economic policies, there had to be an enemy to fear.
Tampoco creo yo que se haya triunfado totalmente sobre el marxismo. El marxismo es como un fantasma. Cuesta mucho tomarlo. Mejor dicho, no se puede tomar.
Chile is by all odds the best success story in Latin America today. In fact, I did meet with Mr. Pinochet, but I was never advised by him. I never got a penny from the Chilean government, but I am more than willing to share in the credit for the extraordinary job that our students did down there.
There's a standard way of privatizing something, like when Margaret Thatcher wanted to privatize the British railroads. The technique was defund them. And then when they don't work, people get angry. You say, let's do something. So you hand it over to private enterprise, which totally ruins them, and then the state has to come back in, big cost, and try to reconstruct it somehow. It's known as privatization. And when it tanks, as it will, when the economy tanks, there's a technique. You pick up your copies of Milton Friedman and Hayek and Ayn Rand, and you run to the nanny state that you've nurtured, and you make sure that they bail you out. That's really existing capitalism, and it means that the scam can go on.
Friedrich A. Hayek was an Austrian economist who, like Mises, studied under Karl Menger at the University of Vienna. Hayek claims that his transformation into a, quote, classical liberal started after he read Ludwig von Mises' book, Socialism.
Hayek and I had been associated for a very long time, that I had been to a meeting that had been called by Hayek to try to bring together the believers in a free, open society.
In his 1974 biography, Hayek writes, "It may be said that effective and rational economic policies can be implemented only by a superior leader of the philosopher-statesman type under powerful autocracy." In an article published in the New York Times on May 7, 1979, Hayek writes, "I have seen in some South American countries the most extraordinary progress. In that much condemned country, Chile, the restoration of only economic freedom and not political freedom has led to an economic recovery that is absolutely fantastic. At times it is necessary for a country to have, for a time, some form or other of a dictatorial power. As you will understand, it is possible for a dictator to govern in a classical liberal way, and it is also possible for a democracy to govern with a total lack of classical liberalism. Personally, I prefer a liberal dictator to democratic government lacking in liberalism." Hayek met with Pinochet and other regime officials in 1977, who Hayek described as educated, reasonable, and insightful men. Pinochet asked Hayek to send him copies of his writings, which Hayek did. While visiting Chile, Hayek gave an interview to El Mercurio, where he states that every now and then democracy needs a good cleansing by a strong government. The Pinochet regime named its 1981 constitution after Hayek's book, The Constitution of Liberty.
The Road to Serfdom. The book clearly and logically explained how any form of central government planning usually leads to serfdom or servitude, slavery.
The Road to Serfdom was probably the first serious economic book that I read. He was one that got me interested. I feel, an attachment to him intellectually. He was absolutely right on the road to serfdom.
The Road to Serfdom was a sort of a manifesto and a call to arms to prevent the accumulation of a totalitarian state.
Hayek explained that capitalism is the only system of economics compatible with human dignity, prosperity, and liberty.
One of the arguments you've been advancing in the last few years is that you will never be able to defeat inflation until you tackle the trade unions.
So long as there are possibilities of workers prevent other workers from working, I think we still have an intolerable position, which is not compatible with an operating market system.
Most famously, who loved this book? Ronald Reagan. Reagan praised Hayek. He talked about people waking up to the dangers of big government. He said this guy did it.
The Mises Institute was established in 1982 by Lew Rockwell, Burton Blumert, and Murray Rothbard. Almost immediately after its creation, the Mises Institute began publishing criticism of compulsory integration, attacks on Abraham Lincoln, and neo-Confederate propaganda. Institute scholars have also spoken to racist groups such as League of the South. Murray Rothbard, a student of Ludwig von Mises, made it his goal to fuse capitalism with libertarianism in the United States, and is considered the founder of anarcho-capitalist philosophy. Murray Rothbard published a manifesto for right-wing populists in 1992 titled, What is Right-Populism? Rothbard expressed his discontent with the fact that David Duke lost his election, writing, "It is fascinating that there's nothing in Duke's current program or campaign that cannot also be embraced by paleo-conservatives or paleo-libertarians." In the same article, Rothbard calls for unleashing police in the inner city to clear the streets of what he calls bums and vagrants. Rothbard was a key figure in formulating the paleo-libertarian strategy, which was a strategy to recruit reactionaries and white supremacists into the right libertarian movement. Rothbard's right-wing program also calls for an America First strategy, which was the same terminology used by David Duke in his campaign, and was later picked up by Donald Trump as a dog whistle to neo-Nazis. Rothbard finishes his manifesto writing, "So far, every one of these right-wing populist programs is totally consistent with a hardcore libertarian position." In his book, The Betrayal of the American Right, which was published by the Mises Institute, Rothbard boasts about how he successfully stole the libertarian label from the left, writing, "One gratifying aspect of our rise to some prominence is that for the first time in my memory, our side had captured a crucial word from the enemy, libertarians, had long been simply a polite word for left-wing anarchists, but now we had taken it over."
Here, the term libertarian means the opposite of what it always meant in history. Libertarian, throughout modern European history, meant socialist and anarchist. It meant the socialist movement, the workers' movement and the socialist movement, sort of broke into two branches, roughly. One statist, one anti-statist. The statist branch led to Bolshevism and Lenin and Trotsky and so on. The anti-statist branch, which included Marxists, left Marxists, kind of merged more or less into an amalgam with a big strain of anarchism into what was called libertarian socialism. So libertarian in Europe always meant socialist.
In 1992, Rothbard bashed the Republican establishment, the Democratic Party, and the mainstream media for what he referred to as a campaign of fear and hate against former KKK Grand Wizard and failed U.S. Senate candidate David Duke. Rothbard blamed Duke's loss on the black vote in his 1992 essay, Right-Wing Populism. Similar sentiments were echoed in Ron Paul's infamous newsletters published between 1988 and 1996, when Ron Paul had briefly retired from politics.
In a copy obtained by CNN of the Ron Paul Political Report, one of several newsletters published in his name during the 1980s and 90s, quote, "Order was only restored in LA when it came time for the blacks to pick up their welfare checks." Another excerpt. "The criminals who terrorize our cities, in riots and on every non-riot day, are not exclusively young black males, but they largely are. As children, they are trained to hate whites, to believe that white oppression is responsible for all black ills, to fight the power, to steal and loot as much money from the white enemy as possible."
Ron Paul's former chief of staff, Lew Rockwell, who was also a founder and chairman of the Mises Institute, was the editor of the newsletters. The racist and homophobic content didn't come as a surprise to those who closely followed the careers of Lew Rockwell and Ron Paul. In 1990, Lew Rockwell made the case for bringing racialized politics and culture wars to the forefront of the libertarian movement. He called this new movement paleo-libertarianism.
The Washington Post reports today, they quote your former secretary about these newsletters that went out under your name back in the 1990s, some of them with racially tinged, some say outright racist comments in them. This is your former secretary, Renee Hathaway. She says it was his newsletter and it was under his name, so he always got to see the final product. He would proof it. You have said in the past, sir, that you didn't always see what was in that newsletter. What's the truth?
Well, she's made that story up. She also said that I was in and out of the office every single day. The office wasn't even in the town that I live.
But there are reports that you made almost $1 million off of them in 1993.
Oh, I'd like to see that money.
Though Ron Paul now denies writing the newsletters, he admitted to writing them in 1996, insisting that there was nothing racist about the newsletters he had published for almost a decade. The newsletters became a national controversy in 2008 and 2012 when Ron Paul ran for president, sending the right libertarian movement into full panic mode. Former KKK Grand Wizards David Duke and Don Black made headlines in 2008 and 2012 for supporting Ron Paul's presidential bid. Don Black also showed up to one of Ron Paul's events and had his picture taken with Paul. On Don Black's own radio show, he expressed how he viewed Paul as a rare ally in Washington. Everybody, all of us back in the 80s and 90s, felt Paul was, unusual in that he had actually been a congressman, that he was one of us.
His stand on the issues coincide with ours. I knew about the newsletters, of course, when they were being printed. I certainly was under the impression Ron Paul wrote them.
In 1981, David Duke, Don Black, and numerous other white supremacists were involved in a plot to overthrow the government of the island of Dominica. This was part of a larger plot to overthrow the government of Grenada and create a white supremacist utopia. The day that they were to leave on their journey to topple the Dominica government, they were arrested by ATF agents and were found with over 30 automatic weapons, handguns, rifles, shotguns, dynamite, ammunition, a Confederate flag, and a Nazi flag. According to another white supremacist involved in this fascist conspiracy, Texas Congressman Ron Paul and Texas Governor John Connally were aware of the plot and approved of it. In February 2012, the hacker group Anonymous hacked into the emails of a white supremacist political party called American Third Position and discovered direct ties to Ron Paul.
Earlier this year, Ron Paul ran for the Republican presidential nomination. He spoke at the 50th anniversary dinner of the John Birch Society in Appleton, Wisconsin.
The John Birch Society was founded in Indianapolis on December 9, 1958. It was chartered under the general laws of Massachusetts as a non-profit educational organization.
These crossed American flags frame a portrait of the John Birch Society's founder, Robert Welch. He also wrote a book, The Politician, which he says is not to be considered the doctrine of the society, and another one, the Blue Book, which he says should be. In them and in other writings, he has accused former President Eisenhower of treason. Bumper stickers attacking the United Nations, socialism, urging support of the police. Books attacking all recent administrations, including the present one. None dare call it treason. The United Nations, the fearful master. And the Council on Foreign Relations, the invisible government. And other books supporting Senator Goldwater. Also available at the American Opinion Library are posters attacking the Civil Rights Bill and others purporting to show Martin Luther King at a communist training school.
It's easy for me to recognize this revolutionary agitation in disguise. But the average American finds it's hard to believe that something as worthy and noble sounding as a civil rights movement could possibly be a communist maneuver.
And inexorably, the people of the United States were being divided according to plan. Among the so-called downtrodden and oppressed, among the supposedly starving and pauperized Negroes, the enemy was referred to as whitey.
A lot of credit has to go to those individuals and those groups that kept the spirit alive. And that's what I think the Birch Society has done.
Phase 1 was well on its way. Now it was time to implement Phase 2. Create the appearance of popular support. Beguile the people of the United States and the world into believing the pious fraud that the civil rights uprising, led by a handful of agitators, was a popular movement of the whole Negro race in the United States.
That has been the important role for the Birch Society, is to tell these truths and make sure people know about it and understand it.
On the 40th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, you said this on the floor of the House. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not improve race relations or enhance freedom.
Taking over private property to tell people what to do with their private property is like taking over the bedrooms and saying what you're going to do in the bedroom.
You mean
so if
restaurants,
you can take,
right? You mean those dining.
I'm talking about private property. I am talking about all private property. Wait.
You mean those dining counters that black people tried to integrate?
In the United States, the communist plans call for two revolutions at once. A revolution of a supposedly oppressed proletariat or working class against a capitalistic system that is supposed to breed wage slavery, unemployment, poverty, crises, and war. Currently, what the communists call their Negro Revolutionary Movement, now masquerading behind the humanitarian banners of civil rights, is contributing tremendous momentum to the communist plans to take over the United States.
You see the fear of radicalism and of Bolshevism time and time again being articulated, but I think it's important to understand that it's not a fear of real radicalism or real communism or real socialism or real subversion. It's what Frank Donner in The Age of Surveillance calls a Mencken construct. It's a paranoid, hyperbolic fear of what is perceived to be communist.
My parents had friends that were in the John Birch Society, guys that worked at the telephone company, FBI agents, cops, lawyers that would come by the house. They basically have John Birch meetings and talk about the New World Order and the plans for the country and the 3 mega regions and how they transfer our liberties into foreign treaties. Everything that's basically 90% complete.
Now, I see what has happened over these many years that the Birch Society has done. It's just planted a lot of seeds. A lot of seeds have been planted, and they're coming to fruition. They're bursting forth, and therefore we were able to tap into this sentiment.
In the alt-right's origins, when we were first using this term, it was a lot hazier than it is now. So there's an interesting article by Kevin Deanna, actually, called "What is the Alt-Right" in 2009, and we were actually talking about the Ron Paul movement. We were talking more about libertarianism and anti-war matters and so on. So we hadn't fully evolved to where we are now.
The story of the Koch brothers and an allied group of billionaire donors is told in a new book by the New Yorker magazine reporter Jane Mayer. Mayer reveals that Fred Koch helped build an oil refinery in Nazi Germany, a project approved personally by Adolf Hitler. The refinery was critical to the Nazi war effort. Its oil fueled German warplanes. Before that, Fred Koch built a refinery for Joseph Stalin's Russia. Fred Koch went on to become an original leader of the right-wing John Birch Society. Charles Koch was a member when the group campaigned against the civil rights movement in the 60s.
These documents, some of the documents we're revealing today, talk about are in Charles Koch's own words, funding for the John Birch Society, trying to support its mission.
And he becomes just an absolutely sort of vitriolic anti-communist, and that leads to him being a founding member of the John Birch Society. And he passes those views on to his sons, and both David Koch and Charles Koch, the two that are known as the Koch brothers, were members of the John Birch Society. He built what became the third largest refinery in Germany during the build-up to World War II. And it was a refinery that from the start was meant to help the military effort of the Third Reich. It was clear that Hitler was looking for ways to refine their own oil so that they could fuel the war machine that he was building up at that point. A man named William Rhodes Davis, who was working with Fred Koch, he was a Nazi sympathizer. The U.S. considered him a Nazi agent, actually, and he was the partner in this project, and he needed an okay from Hitler. And to get it, he had to go speak with Hitler himself. Hitler green-lighted the project. Somehow the family wound up with a German nanny who brought up the two oldest boys, Frederick and Charles, who's known today as one of the two Koch brothers. And the nanny herself was a Nazi sympathizer of such fervor that when Hitler invaded France in 1940, she'd been with the Koch family for 5 years, but she said she needed to leave. She wanted to go back to be with the Fuhrer to celebrate. This family was politically, from the start, filled with very strange influences.
Are you a libertarian?
No, I have been a libertarian in my past, but now I consider myself a classical liberal.
He's really advanced those ideas. He's learned to use other language than calling people communists. For example, in his op-ed in the Wall Street Journal earlier this year, he used the term collectivists to describe anyone who basically opposes his agenda.
David Koch ran for office in America in 1980 and got absolutely nowhere because his views and Charles' views were regarded as so far out on the right fringe. They were just really not popular, so they couldn't win what they wanted democratically. So what they did was they funded a kind of an assembly line to change American thinking. I just followed the money, and it kept leading back to the Koch brothers.
Don't a lot of influential people with money want the government to reflect their views?
They absolutely do, but the difference is that when you have $90 billion at your disposal, you can have a certain amount of more success at that. They are very, very strident libertarians who want to shrink the government, reduce taxes, particularly their own taxes, and they want to reduce regulations on all kinds of industries.
It's what Hayek called the fatal conceit, or William Easterly called the tyranny of experts, because that's what it is. It's tyranny.
They're fossil fuel money, and they won't support a candidate, and they will actually attack candidates who take a different position from them on global warming. And they've captured the Congress on it.
How do you know that?
I followed the money. You can take a look at what's happened. 156 members of the current Congress signed a pledge that was created by one of the Koch groups saying they will do absolutely nothing about global warming that costs a single cent.
One crucial difference between American libertarianism and traditional libertarianism. Traditional libertarianism was opposed to any form of dominance and hierarchy. One of the slogans was no God, no master, meaning no ecclesiastical dominance, no masters in industry and personal life, families, anywhere else. American libertarianism is quite different. It's perfectly happy to support masters. In fact, it extols them. It's in favor of it. It wants no interference with the domination and control of people in the workforce, let's say. That's very counter to
traditional libertarianism, either in Europe or, for that matter, in the United States.
Conflicts regarding scarce resources can only be avoided if all scarce resources are assigned as private, exclusive property to some specified individual or group of individuals.
A brand of what's called anarchism in the United States, and to an extent in England, if you take a look at it, it's advocacy of the most extreme form of autocracy and oppression that has ever existed. The policies very quickly turn into concentration of power in the hands of unaccountable private institutions.
Hans Hermann Hoppe is a German-born Austrian school economist and anarcho-capitalist philosopher who was mentored by Murray Rothbard. In 2006, Hoppe founded the Property and Freedom Society to counter the Friedman and Hayek-influenced Montpellier Society, which Hoppe has criticized as socialist. In his book, Democracy, the God That Failed, Hoppe calls for physically removing anyone who is a threat to the paleo-libertarian order. There can be no tolerance towards Democrats and communists in a libertarian social order. They will have to be physically separated and expelled from society.
Many of the leading lights associated with the alt-right have appeared here at our meetings in the course of the years. My name is also regularly mentioned in connection with the alt-right.
So many conservatives have always wanted to kind of turn back the clock. In Rothbard, in his speech in 1992, he spoke about some people want to repeal the Great Society. Some others really want to repeal the New Deal. Others want to repeal Lincoln's administration. Some of us want to go back to the Constitution.
Many of its leading lights have distinctly libertarian leanings, most notably those that have come here, which of course was the reason for having them invited in the first place. All alt-righters that have appeared here, for instance, have been familiar with Rothbard and his work.
Murray promised that he didn't want to just turn back the clock of social democracy, he wanted to break it. I think the alternative right might be in a situation where we will no longer be bound by that clock of the 20th century.
And all of them, those that I had here, to the best of my knowledge, were outspoken supporters of Ron Paul during his primary campaign for the Republican Party's nomination as presidential candidate. All of them. As Buchanan before and Trump now, they are adamant about complementing a policy of restrictive, highly selective and discriminating immigration, which is entirely compatible with libertarianism and its goal of freedom of association and the opposition to forced integration. The alt-right has brought out many insights that are of central importance in approaching an answer, namely of how to maintain a libertarian order.
What I can tell you right now is that after having been in the libertarian movement for a decade, I have seen this type of racialized rhetoric, and I have seen it up close. But what I stated yesterday on my Facebook page, and some of the statement that I really want to stick by here, is the weird brand of ethno-nationalist mumbo-jumbo from Trump did in part come from the libertarian movement. But you know what? That's why we true libertarians are so glad that Trump is the nominee. Why? Because now all the Nazis, the crazies, and the other turds have left our movement. I mean, congratulations, Republicans. Thanks for helping the libertarians clean house. At the very least, Trump has exposed Alex Jones as the fascist child that I have been telling people that he was for years. He's a mountebank and a fraud and a snake oil salesman. And isn't it amazing, too, that the people who have been terrorizing us for the last decade about government putting us all in FEMA camps, remember that? They've now embraced the ideology of people who actually put people in camps.
The racism that's surfacing is in considerable measure a reaction to the neoliberal policies of the last generation,
which have simply undermined a very large part of the population. In fact, for a majority of the population, conditions have stagnated or declined during the period that began basically with Reagan. The racism is kind of an underlying phenomenon, but it surfaces when you have to blame somebody.
Last night, I tell you, to watch that thing on television, as I did, to see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
These are people who heard Ronald Reagan, an extreme racist, incidentally, give his disquisitions about welfare queens driving in limousines, black, of course, to pick up your hard-earned money. They're just saturated with that kind of stuff from talk radio, from Fox, and everything they hear. So these people behind us are being pushed by the federal government in front of us. And we're stalled, you know. Well, they are stalled. It's not because of those people behind them. You take a look at that amalgam and you can see why these people hate the government.
If you want to live in peace with other people and avoid all physical clashes, you must be a private property anarchist, an anarcho-capitalist, or, as I said, a proponent of a private law society.
You can discriminate against somebody who has AIDS. You don't have to associate with them. We would protect the businessman who might not want to hire somebody with AIDS.
But when you start talking about, private dispute resolution agencies, private defense agencies, I mean, there's these short circuits that go off in people's heads.
I think that you can go to some of the big cities and you find out that the schools are drug infested and crime infested, and there's violence and very little education.
When you ran for president in 1988, you called for the abolition of public schools.
I bet that's a misquote. I do not recall that. I'd like to know where that came from.
And of course, we want to go in the direction of privatizing all schools.
The idea is to instill in people the idea that all you care about is yourself. If, since I have enough money, I could send my kid to private school if I wanted to, so who cares if they're public schools? So we should privatize schools to eliminate the conception that we should care if some other kid goes to school.
The healthy 30-year-old young man decides, you know what, I'm not going to spend $200 or $300 a month for health insurance, but, something terrible happens. All of a sudden, he needs it. Who's going to pay for if he goes into a coma, for example? Who pays for that?
In a society that you accept welfareism and socialism, he expects the government to take care of it.
What do you want?
But what he should do is whatever he wants to do and assume responsibility for himself. My advice to him would have a major medical policy, but not before.
But he doesn't have that. He doesn't have it, and he needs intensive care for 6 months. Who pays?
That's what freedom is all about, taking your own risk. This whole idea that you have to prepare and take care of everybody.
This is just savagery, and it goes across the board. In fact, this holds for the whole so-called libertarian ideology. It may sound nice on the surface, but if you think it through, it's just a call for corporate tyranny. It takes away any barrier to corporate tyranny.
That is what, in fact, makes man a sacrificial animal. That man must work for others, concern himself with others, or be responsible for them.